The operational ceiling of a Boeing B-17E Flying Fortress is tightly governed by the number of active power plants and by weight, weather, and damage. At full power, with all 4 Wright Cyclone engines turning, the heavy bomber can climb above 20,000 feet and, under favorable conditions, clear the jagged spine of the Owen Stanley Range in Papua New Guinea. When 2 of those engines fail, the mathematics of flight change instantly. In crude terms, available power is slashed, but the penalty is not just half the thrust. If the failures are on the same side and the propellers cannot be fully feathered, the dead engines can windmill and turn into giant disks of drag. The remaining engines may have to run at emergency power just to hold a shallow altitude, while asymmetric drag and yaw consume what little performance is left. If the terrain ahead rises faster than the compromised aircraft can climb, the flight path intersects the ground. Pilot skill matters at the margins, but physics sets the outer wall. On January 8, 1943, the bomber designated serial 41-9234 faced this exact geometric limit. The aircraft, assigned to the 65th Bomb Squadron, had just completed a strike in the Leh area, an attack tied to Japanese shipping and harbor approaches off the New Guinea coast. In the heavy anti-aircraft fire over the target, the bomber took catastrophic hits. The damage was not subtle. 2 engines were disabled, systems and control lines were hit, and hydraulics may have been compromised. The nose section was smashed by shrapnel. The pilot, First Lieutenant Raymond Dow, turned the aircraft south toward the safety of Port Moresby, but the mountains stood in the way. The crew was trapped in a shrinking energy box. The aircraft could not climb over the ridges to return to base. Bailout was an option, but parachuting into the dense jungle of the Morabit province often meant death by exposure, capture, or starvation. The alternative was a forced landing. In this region, a belly landing can be lethal if the aircraft hits forest, rocks, or a hidden ridge at speed. The terrain is dominated by vertical spines and triple canopy rainforests that can tear aluminum airframes apart before they ever reach open ground. Lieutenant Dow needed an anomaly, a break in the canopy that could accept a 50,000-pound machine still moving at over 100 miles per hour. Near the Kigzanik village, just below the Black Cat Pass, he spotted it. A steep slope covered in kunai-grass, a hard splash of open country against the surrounding jungle. There was no flat valley floor to choose. He chose the mountainside, and the choice bought braking at the price of a razor-thin approach. This introduced a new hazard. Landing uphill allows gravity to assist in braking, but it also increases the severity of the impact angle. If the approach was too low, the aircraft would fly directly into the face of the hill. If the approach was too high, the bomber would stall and drop. The crew prepared for impact. This procedure required jettisoning loose equipment to reduce the projectile mass inside the fuselage. In a standard ditching, the crew would follow practice positions and brace procedures, often moving through the radio compartment as they prepared for impact. With the hydraulics gone, the landing gear remained retracted. This was preferred. Extending the wheels on soft soil or grass would almost certainly cause the struts to dig in, flipping the aircraft onto its back and crushing the cockpit. The belly skin and lower structure would take the punishment of the slide, not because the bomber was built for it, but because there was no other way to put it down. Lieutenant Dow lined up with the rise of the slope. Airspeed bled away. The margin for error was 0, heavy, wounded, and barely balanced under power. He had to fly it all the way into the grass, holding the wing just above stall until metal met earth. The noise of the 2 remaining engines fighting the incline filled the cabin. Then the contact. The belly of the bomber struck the kunai-grass. The aircraft did not stop instantly. It became a sled, driven by its own momentum up the side of the mountain. The friction was immense. The aluminum skin ground against the earth, shedding speed but creating violent deceleration forces. The structure groaned under the load. This was a controlled crash, but the forces involved were testing the limits of the Boeing airframe. The slide continued for yards, scrubbing off energy, until the structural integrity of the fuselage reached its breaking point. The specific dynamics of that failure would leave a permanent mark on the site, turning the aircraft into a static object that would remain on that hill for decades. The motion stopped. The noise ended. The aircraft had arrived at its final resting place, not at an airfield, but on a remote, grassy ridge where it still lies today. Forced landing is just energy, spent fast and spent brutally. When the B-17 touched the slope, it was moving at roughly 110 miles per hour, an estimate the survivors carried out of the wreck with them. On a runway, that load is paid down over distance. Here, it had only seconds. The hillside turned forward, speed into altitude and impact stress, bleeding momentum quickly, then charging the airframe for every foot of that bargain. The primary mechanism of deceleration was not the air, but friction, aluminum against living ground cover. The slope was carpeted in kunai-grass, tall, coarse, and fibrous. As the belly slid through it, stalks hooked seams and rivet lines, multiplying drag far beyond bare soil. The underside was grabbed and held back while the wing mass and engines tried to keep going. This differential force created a massive bending moment along the length of the fuselage. The airframe is designed to handle aerodynamic loads, not the shearing force of a ground slide. The structure held together past the wings, which are reinforced by the heavy carry-through spars. But aft of the radio room, where the fuselage is lighter and interrupted by openings and cutouts, the damage pattern is consistent with a major structural failure near that point. This fracture was the final release of the impact energy. The tail section settled into the grass, separated from the forward hull. In the accounts that survived the crash, there is no decisive report of a post-impact fire consuming the wreck in those first moments, a thin margin that spared the men who were still inside. The specific location of this breakup dictates the modern status of the site. The aircraft lies on a slope where access is limited, seasonal, and fragile. Getting heavy recovery equipment anywhere near the wreck would be an operation measured in weeks, not hours, if it can be justified at all. Any serious attempt to remove the B-17 would likely require cutting the airframe into small, portable sections, sacrificing the historical integrity of the artifact and inviting legal and community resistance. Helicopter extraction is equally constrained. The altitude and the unpredictable winds of the Black Cat Pass limit the lift capacity of utility helicopters. Attempting to lift a multi-ton wing section or a fuselage block poses an unacceptable risk to the flight crew and the airframe. The static load of the aluminum is compounded by the suction of the mud and the entanglement of 80 years of root growth. Tearing the wreck free would likely disintegrate the corroded structure. Consequently, the site is treated by guides, locals, and responsible researchers as a look but do not touch location. The physical evidence remains locked in the position where it came to rest in January 1943. The damage pattern, the snapped fuselage, the crumpled nose, the battered engines, is a frozen record of the deceleration forces. A careful survey does not move the evidence. It documents the position of the debris field to reverse engineer the crash dynamics. The arrangement of the metal tells the story of the slide. However, the structural damage is not the only story the airframe has to tell. While the break in the fuselage reveals the physics of the crash, the skin of the aircraft holds a different kind of data. A close inspection of the aluminum panels reveals a discrepancy that has nothing to do with the impact and everything to do with the factory floor. The surveyor arriving at the Kigsenich site faces an immediate contradiction. The aircraft is documented as a United States Army Air Force's heavy bomber, yet the physical evidence on the ground deviates from the standard factory specification for a Boeing B-17E. Resolving this discrepancy requires a strict adherence to the rules of survey-only archaeology. The investigator is forbidden from cutting into the airframe to check part numbers or scrubbing the metal to reveal stamped serials. The evidence must be read from the surface, distinguishing between the traumatic damage of the crash and the slow degradation of the jungle environment. The first task is to validate the structural failure. The fuselage is severed cleanly aft of the radio compartment. To the untrained eye, this might appear to be random damage from the slide or post-crash scavenging. However, an engineering analysis identifies this location as a classic fuselage stress riser. In a monocoque design, the skin of the aircraft carries the load. Any opening cut into that skin, such as a window, a hatch, or a gun position, interrupts the flow of stress through the metal. The radio room hatch creates a geometric discontinuity in the upper fuselage. When the tail wheel dragged through the kunai-grass, it acted as a lever, applying a massive downward torque on the rear section. The force traveled forward until it hit the first major interruption in the skin, the radio room cutout. The metal could not distribute the load around the gap fast enough and the structure sheared. The surveyor looks for the specific signature of this failure. The tier lines are sharp and directional, consistent with a single catastrophic overstress event in 1943. This differs fundamentally from the jagged, crumbling edges caused by corrosion, which is a slow chemical process that eats away the aluminum over decades. By mapping the sharp shears against the soft rot, the surveyor reconstructs the exact state of the airframe the moment it stopped moving. Identifying the specific machine without a data plate requires correlating visible structural features with production records. This aircraft is a late production B-17E, built near the end of the E model run. One reason it can show small configuration quirks that don't always match a single textbook diagram. Aircraft built this late in the sequence often incorporate field modifications and experimental configurations that do not appear in the standard manuals. The surveyor verifies the configuration of the tailgun enclosure and the specific shape of the waist windows. These geometric details act as a fingerprint, confirming that this airframe is indeed part of the final batch from the Boeing plant. The preservation of the site depends on this hands-off approach. Any attempt to pry open panels to find hidden stencils creates new damage vectors. The surveyor must rely on what is visible. The aluminum skin, though oxidized, remains largely intact due to the high quality of the 1940s alloy. However, as the inspection moves from the structural breaks to the surface finish, a significant anomaly appears. A standard Army Air Forces bomber of this era was often delivered in olive drab, but under the harsh equatorial sun, the surviving paint on this fuselage does not weather like a single, straightforward American finish. In sheltered pockets, a different palette persists, evidence that this airframe carried, at minimum, markings and coatings associated with British allocation before it was pressed into U.S. Army service. The primary forensic tool used to identify the provenance of the Kigsonic wreck is not a caliper or a tape measure, but the study of paint stratigraphy. This discipline treats the surface of the aircraft as a geological formation, where each layer of pigment represents a distinct era in the machine's history. On a standard recovery, the investigator might sand down a section of the hull to read the layers. On a protected survey site, the environment has already done the work. The weathering of the aluminum skin reveals a timeline that contradicts the official United States Army markings. The most visible evidence is the national insignia on the fuselage. To the naked eye, it appears to be a standard white star on a blue circular field, the hallmark of American air power in 1942. However, the integrity of this symbol is failing. The blue pigment is flaking away, and beneath it, a different geometric shape is emerging. It is a concentric circle of dull red and blue. This is the ghost roundel, a persistent visual echo of the Royal Air Force. The existence of this marking is explained by the bond between layers that were applied in different contexts at different times by different hands. Evidence tied to this airframe points to British allocation and a factory-style temperate sea. Finish on the upper surfaces, extra dark sea, gray paired with dark slate gray. Beneath later overpainting, the underside tone described in surviving accounts reads like a lighter British practice color. And whatever the exact shade, the deeper factory coats often cling longer than the quick wartime markings applied on top. As the war accelerated and allocation shifted, the airframe's administrative destiny changed faster than paint could keep up. There was rarely time or appetite to strip a bomber back to bare metal in the middle of operational urgency. Instead, markings were often overpainted in place, roundels, stars, serials, and stencils, layered as paperwork caught up to necessity. Done quickly, with imperfect surface prep, those top coats could fail first in tropical sun and rain, peeling away to reveal the tougher, earlier layers beneath. Over 80 years, in the high UV environment of Papua New Guinea, the weaker bond of the American overpaint has degraded. The top layer oxidizes and peels, exposing the more durable factory finish underneath. The gray ghost is not gray because of fading. It is gray because the original RAF primer has outlasted the U.S. Army olive drab. The stratigraphy proves that this aircraft, serial 41-9234, lived two distinct lives before it ever left the ground. It began as the Fortress 2A, serial FL461, before being overwritten by the demands of the Pacific Theater. This specific detail acts as the primary anchor proof for the survey. It confirms the identity of the wreck without requiring the recovery of a data plate. The paint tells the story of the administrative reversal that sent the bomber to the Pacific instead of the Atlantic. It documents the urgency of 1942 in a way that paper records cannot. The physical object is a hybrid, wearing the colors of two nations simultaneously. With the machine positively identified and the mechanics of its arrival understood, the investigation pivots to the human component. The structural failure of the fuselage and the specific preservation of the paint are interesting engineering anomalies, but they are merely the container for the event. The purpose of the forced landing was not to save the aluminum, but to preserve the crew. The decision to put the aircraft on the ground initiated a new chain of constraints, governing who walked away and who remained on the hill. The calculation of risk shifts immediately after the airframe comes to a halt. The threat is no longer kinetic energy, but exposure, injury, and the proximity of hostile forces. When the B-17 stopped moving on the slope, 9 men were on board. 7 walked away. This outcome defines the event as a partial success. The machinery was destroyed, but the primary payload, the trained aircrew, was largely preserved. The distribution of casualties correlates directly with the structural failure identified in the survey. The tail gunner, Sergeant Henry Bowen, was positioned in the extreme rear of the fuselage. When the tail section whipped downward and snapped, the G-forces in this compartment were unsurvivable. He was killed instantly. The radio operator, Sergeant Robert Albright, was located near the breakpoint and sustained critical wounds. The forward crew, protected by the intact flight deck and the cushioning effect of the uphill slide, suffered minor injuries. The survivors faced an immediate logistical constraint. They were stranded in the Morobe province, miles from Allied lines, carrying a wounded man. The terrain that had accepted the crash landing now became an obstacle to extraction. This is the principle of terrain denial. The landscape is not merely difficult, it actively opposes movement. The slopes are pitched at angles that require 4 points of contact to climb. The vegetation restricts visibility to a few feet, neutralizing the advantage of visual signaling. In 1943, this terrain denial meant that the crew could not self-evacuate without assistance. Rescue arrived in the form of Australian commandos and Papuan scouts operating in the Black Cat area. These units specialized in traversing the green hell of the jungle. They provided the navigation and physical support necessary to carry Sergeant Albright and guide the others to safety. Despite these efforts, Sergeant Albright succumbed to his wounds days later. The decision was made to bury the dead near the site initially, marking the location as a temporary cemetery. This legal and ethical status as a site of fatality fundamentally changes the rules of engagement for any future survey. It transforms the wreckage from a debris field into a memorial. The difficulty of that evacuation explains why the aircraft remains where it fell. The terrain that trapped the crew still denies modern salvage. No staging ground, no easy line of approach, no safe way to bring heavy lift to the ridge. Inaccessibility is not just a backdrop here, it is the site's protection. The outcome of the event was a trade. The energy of the crash was dissipated by the destruction of the airframe, sparing the majority of the crew. The United States Army Air Forces wrote off the asset, striking serial 41-9234 from the active inventory. The gray ghost was abandoned to the elements. For the next several decades, the jungle began to reclaim the aluminum, wrapping the fuselage in vines and filling the interior with soil. However, the isolation that was intended to bury the aircraft eventually attracted a different kind of visitor. The site did not disappear, it became a destination. The rate of decay for an aluminum airframe in a tropical rainforest is an unknown variable governed by local chemistry. While the 6000 series alloy used by Boeing is highly resistant to oxidation, it is not immune to the environment. The wreck of the B-17E sits in a perpetual cycle of moisture and heat. The canopy of the jungle traps humidity against the metal skins, creating a corrosion trap that slowly consumes the structure. Predicting how long the gray ghost will remain structurally recognizable is a matter of measuring the chemical aggression of the soil against the passivation layer of the metal. This uncertainty drives the strategy of in situ preservation. This concept is distinct from simple abandonment. It is a deliberate decision to manage the site as an open-air museum rather than attempting a high-risk recovery. In a traditional museum restoration, the object is stripped of its context, polished, and placed in a sterile, climate-controlled hangar. It becomes a pristine artifact, but it loses its connection to the event. By leaving the aircraft on the slopes of the Black Cat Pass, the surveyor preserves the spatial relationship between the machine and the terrain. The broken fuselage, the scattered debris, and the specific angle of rest are all integral parts of the historical record. The site itself is the exhibit. This approach requires a shift in stewardship. The primary threat to the wreck is no longer the crash dynamics, but human interaction. The aircraft has become a primary waypoint on the Black Cat Track, a popular trekking route for historians and adventurers. This accessibility introduces a new wear factor. Every boot that scuffs the wing root and every hand that grips a torn panel introduces oils, acids, and abrasion to the surface. Over decades, this traffic creates a cumulative erosion that can outpace the natural weathering of the jungle. Stewardship of the gray ghost depends less on rules than restraint. Out here, enforcement is a fiction. What protects the wreck is the value locals and trekkers choose to place on it. The British ghost markings are more than a curiosity. They are the site's most fragile proof. Once the bond fails and the paint flakes away, the Lend-Lease history disappears into the soil. Once the primer bond fails and the paint flakes away, the visual proof of the Lend-Lease history will be lost to the soil. There is also a hard boundary that is not technical. Because the site began as a temporary grave for Sergeant Henry Bowen and Sergeant Albright, disturbance carries a moral weight that outlasts any curiosity. With the crew accounted for in 1943, there is no mandate to break the ground. The aircraft is allowed to rest. The legacy of serial 41-9234 is defined by its persistence. It was built to fight in Europe, repainted for the Pacific, and sacrificed to save its crew on a grassy ridge in Papua New Guinea. It survived the violence of the anti-aircraft fire and the friction of the slide. Now it survives the slow siege of the jungle. It remains a permanent checkpoint on the Black Cat Track, a silent instructor in the constraints of 1940s, logistics, and the physics of survival. The aluminum on the hill is not just debris, it is a fixed point in history, verifying the reality of the war for every person who hikes the trail to see it.